Welcome to the Church Without Walls. I'm John, and this is my daughter,
Peyton.
Peyton. And we're the Church Without Walls. And I know a lot of people are might be tuning in for the first time because they're home because they're self-quarantining, doing the yes, you've got the 64 box. I used to dream about getting a box of 64 when I was a kid. Now they're plentiful. Oh, Jesus. Anyway, today I do want to talk to you about something that's rather phenomenological. It's a dichotomy, actually, especially in like Christian news. You see all kinds of headlines about famous people either leaving the faith, like, for example, um, the lead singer of Caedmon's Call, or Derek Webb, or the lead songwriter for Hillsong Church, or you see Rhett and Link, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Rhett and Link giving their deconversion, their deconstruction testimonies. And Aaron Rodgers is another one. So you see it. You can go on and on. By the way, I mean there's others too, but so people are trying to wrap their minds around that, and a lot of times they say silly things and think silly things about people like that, like they were never really truly Christian, or they're not saved, or they were never of us, and they say things that exacerbate the problem and draw a dividing line that makes things worse for sharing the gospel and for shining a light on Christ and his benevolence. But then you have this at the same time, you have these people that you'd never expect would be having a spiritual experience and a conversion. People like Shia LaBeouf, and I'm going to pick celebrities now and I'll explain that in a moment. But even Brad Pitt has come back from his announced rebellious period of atheism and agnosticism. He has talked about coming back to spirituality. You have people like Kanye West, who's made a big splash. You have one of the biggest ones who I'd like to talk about today is Ben Affleck. And I want to talk about Ben because he was such a vocal atheist, mocking Christianity with his partner, Matt Damon, for a long time, even making movies mocking the Christian faith. And now to hear him, he speaks in a very humble way about his faith and so forth. So I want to talk to you about how does all this happen? And what do you see in the testimonies of both the people leaving the faith and the people coming to the faith? Because one of the things I see in the people leaving the faith is they've been in the pool for a long time. In other words, they grew up in the faith and they're walking away from it. It's not like they dallied in it. It's not like they came to the table like a few of the passages in scripture and tasted of it and said, it's not for me, and walked away. They were raised in the faith and they left it, and it was tremendously painful for them. Not only their upbringing was in a way traumatic in ways, but the leaving the faith was painful. And so it's not something they're doing to advance their career or something like that. Now, I have to say this. My mother used to say, never quote somebody who's still alive. Because they may end up disappointing you in a week or two or a month or that. This message is not going to fall under that. If Kanye becomes a Satan worshiper in a month, this message will still stand, because I'm only using names that everyone's familiar with to express to you how thousands and thousands and thousands of people sort this thing through and end up with different conclusions. They look at some of the same evidence and end up in little different conclusions. So let me start with a history lesson. And it's probably one of the most famous deaths in the world. It's the real March Madness. And I know everyone's giving up March Madness for Lent, right? That's what we'd like everyone to believe. We're giving up all this stuff, including toilet paper, for Lent, and not the coronavirus. But the true March Madness happened in the Roman Senate many, many, many years ago, with the assassination of Julius Caesar on this day, on the Ides of March. And so you have the death of Caesar is very famous. It was probably given a boost when the greatest writer of the English language characterized Caesar in a play, and his last words, "Et tu, Brute," and even you, Brutus, which was a Latin expression. The historians tell us it was close, but not exactly right, because they have Caesar speaking Greek, saying "kai su teknon," even you, my son. Now, the Roman Senate saw Caesar as not just a literal tyrant, but a figurative one, and so they drew their daggers against him. History tells the story a little different than what's accepted, in that Caesar initially began to fight back, and he used his arm as like a shield, and he drew his own dagger, which tells you, I'm part of. It wasn't just the senators who assassinated Caesar who didn't follow that rule. Caesar himself had a concealed weapon, and apparently he drew it, and he fought back against his assailants, and maiming a couple of them before he saw Brutus, who history also tells us was more than likely Caesar's illegitimate son, which would explain what Caesar says in the Greek when he says, "Kai su teknon," even you, my child. It's a lot more tender than "Et tu, Brute," even though I think Shakespeare liked the sound of "Et tu, Brute." He liked the sound of the Latin more than the roughness of the Greek. But the word teknon, my child, it's like the word Abba, my father. There's a tenderness in it. And it's said that when Caesar realized that his own child wasn't coming to help him fend off the assailants, but was part of them, he gave up the ghost. He pulled his toga over his head and allowed them to kill him. This is maybe Roman dramaticism, or it may have actually happened. It's a very dramatic scene. Many years later, Nero's mother was assassinated on the order of Nero himself. And when the assailants, the Praetorians, came and drew their swords, it's said that Nero's mother opened her robe and revealed her womb, and she said, "Strike me here." The idea being that she was letting her murderers know that she knew who ordered the hit. And is that drama, or did that really happen? I don't know. But I bring up the death of Caesar, not just because today's the anniversary of it, but because it's well accepted by everyone, even the small technicalities that might be talked about. And yet the historical record for it is sparse. There's a paucity of the historical record of the death of Caesar. Now, we live in a time where the death of Christ is well accepted by nearly every legitimate scholar in the field of New Testament studies, and that includes theists and non-theists, atheists, agnostics, people who don't follow Christianity as a faith, but they study it for their livelihood. And nearly every credentialed scholar agrees that not only did Jesus live, but he was put to death by order of Pontius Pilate. That's well attested to, not even argued about, other than some, wingnuts on the internet who don't have any credentials. But the vast majority of credentialed scholars realize, and they won't even contest it, Jesus lived. He was put to death by crucifixion on order of Pontius Pilate. Now, where they come to a division is over this idea of resurrection. Now, the majority of them will even agree to this statement, that the disciples, Jesus' followers, believe that they had seen him risen. They'd seen him alive after his death. They'll agree to that, but they won't agree as to whether this was a premonition, a delusion, or an actual truism. Of course, Christians take it to be true. And so I want to talk to you about that. Now it's well attested, the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. There's arguments for it. There's evidence for it beyond simple blind faith. But I bring that up to you because when you find these people leaving the faith, it's not because they've come to the conclusion that Jesus isn't real or Jesus isn't true, or maybe the resurrection is a hoax. Now, they eventually come to have to explain that to people because the resurrection really is the founding of the faith of Christianity. If Christianity is founded on an event, and if Christ did not rise, then it's a bunch of hokey. Paul himself says that. If Christ is not risen, we are of all men most miserable. So, and Paul doesn't even suggest that he'd go back to Judaism if Christ didn't rise. He basically rejects it all and says, I'd be an Epicurean, wine, women, and song, for tomorrow we die, which is how many live. But what if it is true? What if it is true? Now, these people who are leaving the faith, when you listen to them, and I encourage you to listen to them, because these are not just celebrities. These are not just famous people. This is not just the Green Bay Packers quarterback or popular YouTube celebrities. These are our sons. These are our brothers. These are, our mothers. These are people who we will come into contact with. People who are living under our roof. These are people who are sitting next to us in a pew in church, even, who are going through this struggle and this process where they are coming to the realization that what they thought was true growing up might not be true. And so they're wrestling with it. And when they finally arrive there, they have exchanged their upbringing for a pursuit of the truth, and it's costly. It oftentimes costs them relationships, especially familial relationships and so forth. But what about these others who are coming into the faith? Even men like Affleck and Brad Pitt, who might be on the periphery, but who have mocked the faith in the past, or who have tasted of it and have come back to it. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that, because I think the key to understanding all of this is with Brad Pitt and Jennifer Garner. And, I really should say Kanye West, but also the church lady. Remember Dana Carvey's portrayal of the church lady on Saturday Night Live. I bring up the church lady because many of the people who leave the faith describe their upbringing as sounding like a Saturday Night Live church lady skit. In other words, that was their experience growing up. You listen to Aaron Rodgers talk about his growing up, and a lot of the deductions that deconversions come to is the fact that they heard a lot about love in Sunday school. Love, is all over Jesus's testimony, and it's all over the Holy Scriptures, the Christian Scriptures, right? What we call the Bible. Love, the greatest of these is love, and people read these verses at their weddings, even if they're nominal Christians or non-Christians. They'll read from 1 Corinthians 13 about how love acts and what love does, and how the greatest of these is love. And Christian pastors will quote stuff directly from the words and mouth of Jesus, where Jesus says, "Look, the world will know that you are my disciples, not by how wise you are or how perfect your life is, but the world will know that you truly are a follower of me if you love one another. And if you love one another to the point of self-sacrifice," which is described later and over in his word. The Apostle John, cousin of Jesus, who was with him on his last night, both leaning on his chest the night before at the Last Supper and standing in front of the cross with the mother of Jesus as Jesus gave up the ghost. The Apostle John echoes what Jesus said about love for one another when he said, "If you have not love in your heart, you don't know God." So it's funny how Christians draw up all these schemes about how we could tell if you're truly a Christian. and they'll talk about fruit, and fruit usually means their version of morality, right? If you go to church, if you dress a certain way, if you vote a certain way, if you act a certain way, if maybe that's just describing a good hypocrite, somebody who acts Christian in the outside. He wears a Christian mask, but he goes home and surfs porn and, mistreats his family or whatever. I don't know. But the definition of fruitfulness to a Christian is very different than what Jesus and John talk about, which they lay it at the foot of love. And this is not just a New Testament thing. It's an Old Testament thing too, where we're told to love God and love others. And if all of our faith was wrapped up in just those two principles, wouldn't there be a different view of Christianity among the world? That we were devoted to our obedience to God, not making sure you're obedient to him, right? If in our livelihood, we gave weight to what God asks us to do, including to forgive our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us, and to walk an extra mile, all these things that Christians give lip service to turn the other cheek, all these things we give lip service to until we're struck on the cheek. And then we're all about, a different variety, a different tribe of Christianity that looks almost militant in some cases. So wouldn't the world be a different place if we actually tried to live by love, and follow the words of Jesus? So you have people who leave the faith because their experience growing up, they might have heard a lot about love, but they didn't really feel it or receive it or see it happen. They didn't see the magic of unconditional love, of forgiveness, of grace. They didn't see it. They heard a lot about it, but they saw the opposite. So they weighed Christianity, found it wanting, and said, something's wrong here. I bring that up because it's really never about Christ. When you see people leaving the faith, they don't say, well, when Jesus, they weren't like Nietzsche, who would say, well, Jesus, his argument about being merciful is weak. So when you see people leaving the Christian faith, they very rarely ridicule the words of Jesus when he is calling on us to look after the widow and the orphan. When he's saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. There was never a more compassionate soul than what you find in the words and the actions of Jesus. So rarely do you see somebody say, well, I was a Christian, but I got to the chapter where Jesus forgives the woman caught in adultery, and I just said, that's ridiculous. I can't follow this guy. Or rarely do you find somebody who sees Jesus, healing somebody who's sick, or sitting with an outcast woman at the well and treating her like a human being with great dignity. Rarely do you see somebody leaving the faith over that. More often than not, you see people leaving the faith not over Christ, but over Christians, and over some kind of variety of ice cream that they grew up in that had the Christian label on it that's just actually repugnant. And they spit it out of their mouth. And oftentimes we don't make the distinction that maybe they're making a good decision on their journey of faith, and maybe they're going to come around the mountain, as happened with Brad Pitt. But now you see these people, right, who are coming into Christianity, and they're full of joy and they've been granted peace. And their experience doesn't sound anything like what Aaron Rodgers expresses about his community growing up. And you say, wow, how does that happen? How does somebody like Kanye West, who has everything, money and fame and influence and pleasure at his beck and call, how does somebody like that end up praising Jesus? Actually, somebody who thought he himself was a godlike figure. How does somebody like that become so humble that he gives of himself to these Sunday services and takes them everywhere, sometimes at great cost to himself, but has a greater influence than thousands of pastors do or missionaries, just with one tweet or one interview and something like that. So I bring up Brad Pitt because he grew up Southern Baptist and he had an Aaron Rodgers like experience. He weighed Christianity, found it wanting because it was really weird, speaking in tongues, all kinds of judgmental Christians who were full of hypocrisy, and it was kind of superstitious and scary and off-putting, and Brad Pitt walked away from it. And he said he went through his rebellious years where he just considered himself an atheist or an agnostic, somebody who doesn't know, which I'm actually fine with agnostics. I think that's an honest opinion. Madeline L'Engle says she is a Christian agnostic. And it's a philosophical understanding that we can't know for sure. And by the way, that's very biblical if you understand it. Let's stop here for a second because we've given the word agnostic a bad connotation. We say it means ignorant, ignoramus, and we put it down, but it means without knowledge. It does. It means without certainty is what some people might call it today, without certainty. And Madeline L'Engle had this wonderful expression. She said, I find myself going in and out of doubt about my Christian faith. And so I'd have to call myself an agnostic because we don't know for sure. And isn't that where faith comes in? That there's good evidence that leads us to believe this is true. And yet we can't know with mathematical certainty that it's true. We can't prove it that it's true. And that's where faith comes in. Now, if faith wasn't a really big part of Christianity, then you could say that might be weakness. But no, faith is a huge part of Christianity. It's not blind faith. It's not based on no reason. It's based on the greatest amount of evidence and the most likely. There's an Occam's razor like feel to Christianity, true Christianity. So to come to grasp with this, to try and on one side, listen to Rhett and Link, and you can hear my show about Rhett and Link here. I'll put the link here. No pun intended. And you can also listen to a similar show about Aaron Rodgers here. I'll put the link over here if you want to listen to the Aaron Rodgers show, which I encourage you to go back and listen to Aaron Rodgers and Rhett and Link talk about their deconversions. We had a lot to say about that. But when you listen to them and you really listen to them, to their experiences, and then you listen to an interview with Kanye West or with Ben Affleck, and we'll talk about Ben in a second, or with Brad Pitt, they're very different. Or another one I love to listen to is Brian Head Welch, the founding, one of the guitarists and founding members of the rock band Korn. Very different experiences. And I would like to suggest to you, it's their communities are different. And if you've ever been in an AA community or a Celebrate Recovery community, you could see it's a lot different than a church, because the judgment and the hypocrisy by definition are minimalized there, and it looks a lot more like what the early church must have felt like. The acceptance, the love, the unconditional love, the willingness to grow together, the willingness that we're all scarred and in need of healing. And we've come to this table to heal together and to help each other and to put a shoulder under somebody else's arm and to walk this together. If that was Aaron Rodgers' experience in community, it would be hard to walk away from that. And you see it with people who've gone through it. And that's one of the reasons that some people come into the faith, because they've had help recovering something that has torn them apart through a faith community that praises Jesus. This is what happened with Ben Affleck, who scoffed at Christianity and scoffed at Christ and was introduced to it through his marriage to Jennifer Garner, which ended in 2018. He says his biggest regret, but they have 3 children together. So how does Affleck consider something he thought was a farce and a superstition? Well, at first in rehab, He saw a tangible effect on him when he began to think about faith and rehab and Christ and so forth. And he saw an effect. And he even talks about it. Let me just share a few of his quotes as I exit full screen. Let me share just a few of the things that Ben says when he opens up about his Christianity. He says, faith is something that I have, but has also been a struggle for me. I just want to stop there and say this is one of the problems with modern Christianity. We don't allow for the struggle. Why don't we allow for the struggle? If we truly read our Bibles, it's filled with faith people struggling, from Jacob, who actually struggles with God, to David, who screams at him one moment and then bows to him the next, to Jesus Christ on the cross saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" and crying tears. The faith walk is a struggle. It's meant to be a struggle. It's not easy because we don't know. All the pixels aren't filled in. There's a mist to it. We see in a glass darkly. There's not a clarity to it. We're walking in the dark, trying to figure things out. And so there is a struggle. But so much of modern Christianity is to pretend there's not, to pretend we have all the pat answers. You know, we've got a book, 200 answers to life's hard questions, or the skeptic's hard questions, and we memorize those answers. And whenever they approach us from the outside, we have a ready answer to whack-a-mole down. How did a king get his wife? Boom, I know that. And can God make a rock too hard that he can't, lift? I know that. And we have all these clever answers until we legitimately ask ourselves or confront our own doubts. And if we don't have those doubts, we're brainwashed because it isn't clear and it isn't provable. And there has to be room for faith. If there's no room for doubt, there's no room for true faith. And so faith and doubt kind of coexist on a continuum. And so Ben says this. He says faith is something that I have, possession, but has also been a struggle for me. Going to church, I really find Christian teaching beautiful and moving. Well, not every church has beautiful and moving teaching. Some churches do everything they can to make Christianity ugly and off-putting, and it's a cacophony. It's not a harmony. So I'm glad for his experience that going to church is beautiful and moving. It wasn't for Aaron Rodgers, and I can understand the difference. Going to church, I really find Christian teaching beautiful and moving. And the hard thing for me is to really, when I struggle, when I suffer, when I see things that are painful, I have doubts. Well, he's a human being and probably an honest one. So he said he's worked to a place. He says, Affleck said he's worked to be open to where his questions lead him, recalling a conversation he had with a man who told him his goal shouldn't always be to be sure. Instead, the actor recalled the man encouraged him to simply seek answers. This is what we're encouraged to do in the faith, to follow our questions and to cherish our questions. As a teacher, and I know that the many teachers who listen to the show will agree with this, I can tell more about the progress of a student by the questions he or she asks than by the answers they give. And I think there's true wisdom in that understanding, that our questions are vitally more important than our answers. And we should be always filled with questions and following them in a pursuit of the truth. So Affleck said he's worked to be open to where his questions lead him, which shows he's more mature than the majority of Christians I've ever known or met. Recalling a conversation he had with a man who told him his goal shouldn't always be to be sure. Instead, the actor recalled the man encouraged him to simply seek answers. That process for Affleck has produced a deeper faith, especially in his commitment to sobriety, something he told the Hollywood Reporter he's doing for his kids, because as he said, I really don't want my children to pay for my sins or to be afraid of me, which is one of the hard parts of being the child of an alcoholic. And of course, Ben's father was an alcoholic. He goes on to say this, and this truly is beautiful. The idea that God, now keep in mind, this is coming from somebody who made fun of God and Jesus, not just in movies, but in interviews. And now he's at this humble place where he's been touched by his ex-wife and by those in rehab, and he's considering his children. And this is that yearning we have in every human heart. Every human being has this yearning, and we suppress it at some points in our life, but it doesn't go away because it's the call of God in our hearts. It's the idea that the prodigal, even on the bar stool, before he ever got to the pigsty, somewhere in the back of his mind knew his father was there and his father wanted him to come home. The idea that God, Jesus, loves us and forgives us, says Affleck. All of us, everybody, all the people that you know and think are great, and all the people that you want to judge and be angry at, Affleck said. So if God loves all of us and encourages us all to love one another and not to judge one another, but to forgive one another, I find that incredibly moving, because that's really God setting an example for us, for how we might be. Jesus looks down from the cross in all his agony and says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. How many times have you had a moment like that in your life where you've been greatly wronged, severely wronged? I mean, no one's been wronged to that point, but severely mistreated, and your first premonition was to forgive them. Your first premonition was an understanding that they're doing this because they're ignorant in some way, and to pray for their well-being, to pray actually that they get to a point of flourishing where they can see that this isn't wisdom and that the road that they're on will lead to destruction, even though right now it gives me great pain and maybe is unjust to others. This was the person of Jesus that is so attractive to people who not only have been scarred in life, but who have scarred others deeply, and they carry the weight of that regret. And this comes out in Affleck too, who basically says one of the most comforting realizations he's had in his faith journey, particularly as he's faced regrets over his alcoholism and divorce, is this, and this is a direct quote from Ben: if God can forgive me, maybe I can forgive myself. You see, it's Jesus who says, come to me, all ye who are weary and who are burdened, and I will give you rest. You could drop those burdens at the feet of the cross. And this is the same journey that happened with Brian Head Welch, a heroin addict who had mistreated people and mistreated himself, and who looked at his daughter and said, I don't want this for her. One of the blessings of children is that it humbles us, and it helps us to appreciate what's important in life. And it also gives us a perspective of how God sees us, because it's God who sees us as children. And he doesn't delight in our suffering. He's in anguish over our suffering. And just as Ben Affleck wants well-being for his children, and Kanye does, and this is why there's something to being a father that helps us see the true God, not the one we grew up with in Sunday school, not the cruel one, the judgmental one, the God full of wrath, but the one full of mercy, the true God, the one that sometimes religion blurs and obfuscates and becomes an obstacle to, instead of a journey to, instead of the finger pointing to the glory of the moon, as Bruce Lee points out. When we get fixated on the finger, we see the warts and the calluses and the fallibility of the finger, and we miss the glory, the heavenly glory that is above us. And so I would suggest to you that the difference between Rhett and Link and Aaron Rodgers and those who've gone through the trauma of the Christian faith and walked away from Christ, who've tasted the bathwater and spit it out, that's a logical response. And that might actually be a step closer to God. But let us consider also these men and women who have been so far apart from God, who have come into the presence of Christ and into the presence of Christians with an overflowing joy and a peace that many of us who grew up in the Christian church didn't see. We didn't see among our fellows, but in a few corners. And so I think we need to be patient with everyone who's on this faith journey, whether they're coming or going, whether they're exiting through the, exiting or entering, or as Brad Pitt, who tasted the ugliness of Christianity, but goes to a Sunday service by Kanye West. And I'll end with this. It's mere Christianity that's bringing people back to the faith. The idea that C.S. Lewis taught about Kanye West's Sunday service is mere Christianity. It's 2 hours of praise. I've been to one. Wendy and I went to the one here in Phoenix. It'll be a 2-hour praise service with a 10-minute gospel message in there. And it's all about the love of God and the sacrifice of Christ. And it was that message that Brad Pitt heard and said that was delightful. And that's our only message, is to point to Christ and say, here is life and meaning. Would you like to join us at the table? See, because at some point, the Father is actually looking down from the roof, awaiting the return of his prodigal, awaiting his son to come home. And he's not waiting to tell him, I told you so. He's not waiting to say, you can't come back until you clean up your life, or, go to the servants' quarters. He knows that his son's condition is a poor one, and he wants him to come back and be found and to be alive again. And what's on the Father's mind is not wrath and punishment or some kind of moral lesson that he wants to teach his rebellious son. What's on the Father's mind is his son is naked and in need, and he's hungry, and he's alone, and he doesn't see me for who I really am. In my son's perception, the best I am is just a benevolent master, but I'm more than that. I'm his father. And if he returns home, I'm going to fall on his neck before he even takes a bath. And I'm going to shower him with kisses, and I'm going to robe his nakedness, and I'm going to shod his shoelessness, and I'm going to give him the dignity of the family that he doesn't really know he has, that he rejected when he left. And we're going to have the biggest party in the world. This is how God thinks. It's not how religion thinks. And that's why it's easy to walk away from the Pharisee brother. And sometimes it's hard to return home because we think of the brother and not the father. We think that our religion is what's happening in the field with our austere brother, older brother, who's got a cold heart and a cruel heart, and who couldn't be further than the father from the father's demeanor. So I'd like you to pray this week. It's Lent. People are giving things up, not only because they have a relationship with Christ and they want to feel his want that he had in the desert when he was tested. We're all being tested now over the coronavirus. It's some very serious thing. But let's make it a time where we can bless one another. So I ask you to pray for people like Rhett and Link and Derek Webb and people who feel they must leave the Father's house, the Father's table, because maybe they haven't really experienced it. I mean, that aspect. Maybe their perception of the Father is warped by those who have been around him. But notice that Affleck says, I found a place for my questions. Rhett and Link never did. When they asked questions, they were ridiculed as being weak in the faith. That's the tribe they grew up in. Aaron Rodgers said the same thing. He said, there was no room for my questions. I was looked upon skeptically with questions. I have up here who's a scientist who was telling the story of a friend of his who grew up and went to university, and he was a youth pastor's son, and he rejected the faith. And when he called him and asked him why, he said, I found out that when you ask questions in church, you're looked on with suspicion. But when you ask questions in science, that's encouraging. That's how we develop our knowledge. That's how we find wisdom. That's how we progress in science, is we're allowed to ask questions. We're encouraged to ask questions, and it's welcome there. Something's wrong. There's something ill within the Christian faith that doesn't make room for questions and doubt, when that's been our tradition from the start. That is the human condition. That is how we try and figure out this whole thing. So let's try and do it together. Open hearts and open minds. I thank you for listening this week. I know we might have some extra listeners because you're staying home from your regular church. We don't want you to stay home from your regular church, but if you do, join us on Sundays at the Church Without Walls, or look for us at the Sparrows Call, where we have a ministry now to people, the nuns, the duns, and the seekers, people who have either walked away from the faith, as Brad Pitt did, as Rhett and Link have done, as Aaron Rodgers have done, or people who are walking by the faith and they only see the elder brother in the field. So we're there for you. I've heard from a lot of mothers whose hearts are broken over their sons or daughters who have walked away from the faith. And I want to bring you hope. Don't be discouraged. They might be following the truth, and you should encourage them to follow the truth. Look, truth doesn't fear scrutiny. If you really believe, if you really have faith that God is real and that the resurrection truly happened, then you shouldn't be out of joint that your children aren't there yet, or they're asking questions that might lead them around the mountain and back there. You shouldn't be showing fear. Let me end with this thing on the idea of shame, right? So with Aaron Rodgers and Rhett and Link, when they leave the faith, it is the tendency of some within the faith, within the tribe, to shame them back into the faith, to get them back into line. And you see this in families. Mothers and fathers will do this when kids rebel in some ways. They say, do you know what you're doing to your mother, or whatever? Do you know your father worked so hard and this is how you repay him? That kind of guilt and shaming. And they try and shame. And if shaming doesn't work, then they shun you. Then they disown you. Oh, that's the prodigal. He's in the far country. And they talk about him like Aaron Rodgers' family talks about him, which is like the elder brother, not the father, in the prodigal son story, Luke 15. If the father in Luke 15 was asked what about how he feels about his son who's on the bar stool in Vegas, he wouldn't throw him under the bus like Aaron Rodgers' father did. He wouldn't. He would tell how he really feels. And you know how he really feels? I yearn for the day my son returns home. I can't wait to wrap my arms around him. I pray for him daily. Would you join me in prayer? That's what he'd say. Now you ask his brother about the son, about his little brother, and he'd say, he'd give you a moral lesson that sounds like a Southern Baptist pulpit. And that's what Aaron Rodgers heard. So here's the thing. Shaming, it doesn't work in that way with people who walked away from the faith, because they feel shame already. And the shame they feel is that they believed something all their lives that is abhorrent and ugly and not true. And now they've arrived at the truth, and they feel ashamed that they felt that way. And that's what inclines them to give a testimony, because the best antidote for shame, the best way to deal with shame, is confession. The best way to deal with shame is confession. And so when Rhett and Link do this show, they're confessing their prior guilt, and they feel bad about it. When Joshua Harris comes out and apologizes to the LGBT community, he's confessing that what he was ugly, and what he has found to be true now, he feels shame that for so many years he lived in that darkness, and he's coming out and he's saying he's sorry. Aaron Rodgers, the same thing. They feel shame for the way they had lived, and they're apologizing. It's a confession. And so when people out of their past try to shame them back in, if you leave the Ku Klux Klan, you feel shame for having been involved in it for 25 years. And you might even give a confession. And when your family and friends who are still in the Klan try and shame you back in, it doesn't make you long for the days of the white sheet. It makes you more ashamed that you were involved in that. And it breaks your heart that you can't somehow communicate the beauty and the truth that you found outside Plato's cave. So we're dealing with a couple of issues here. We're dealing with maybe families and faith communities that don't understand what it's like for people to go through deconversion. And we're dealing with those who are going through deconversion. And this is what the Sparrows Call does. We're trying to alert parents and church staff who might be oblivious to what these kids and people are going through, how to better handle it. And we're also trying to show the kids who are going through it, or the people who are going through it, how their parents hear it and how they feel about it, because they're legitimately concerned for your spiritual well-being. They think you're going to die in hell based on their perceptions. And so we're going to try and handle both these communities differently. And that's why I promised you that one of the next messages we're going to do is how to come out to your evangelical parents. It's going to be controversial. Might not be what you're expecting, but how to come out to your evangelical parents. I was going to call it the 5 worst things you could say to your fundamentalist parents. And so if you want to join me for that, maybe I'll promise and we'll do that next week. We'll see, unless something comes up. But thanks for joining us. Peyton, you've been very patient, and you drew a very colorful picture here. You want to share it with the crowd before we sign off?
Yes, sir.
So here's Peyton's picture.
There's Caesar salad.
Caesar salad.
And then I didn't have breakfast, so milk.
Milk.
And popcorn, because we watched TV last night.
And I see a pepperoni pizza. Is that pepperoni?
Yeah.
Is that a strawberry too?
Oh, yeah, I like strawberries. And then there's gum.
So out of my whole message today, you were motivated to draw the things you like to eat the most. And is that because I talked about Lent and giving up food or something? And you're saying to heck with that? Or what?
I just drew Caesar salad.
Oh, Caesar's salad, because it's the Ides of March. You're a genius. Okay. All right. I see the connection. There's always a connection, folks. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. God bless.